The wind off the Wind River Range cut like glass, hurling sheets of snow across the empty Wyoming wilderness. Daniel Cross pulled his coat tighter, the wool already heavy with ice. 40 years old, his body carried the precision of a Marine who had learned to move quietly, efficiently. But tonight the storm erased everything, footprints, landmarks, even sound. Only the crunch of his boots and the rasp of his breath reminded him he was still alive. He had chosen this cabin because no one else wanted it. Too far from town, too exposed to the mountain weather. But for Daniel, the solitude was part of the bargain. After Iraq, after the years of dust and fire, he needed silence. He thought he had made peace with it until the storm broke that silence with something else. It came first as a faint bark, ragged and out of place against the roar of the wind. Daniel froze, every nerve remembering the old reflex. Stop. Listen. Locate. His hand brushed the rifle slung across his back. Another bark, closer now, rough, broken, carried not in threat, but in plea. Then he saw her. Through the swirl of snow, a shape emerged large, low to the ground at first, then rising. A German shepherd, her sable coat matted with ice, limped toward him. Her body shuddered with exhaustion, but when she reached the clearing, she did something that made his chest tighten. She stood upright on her hind legs, front paws lifted like a soldier raising empty hands. Her amber eyes locked with his. There was nothing wild in them, only urgency, only command. God! Daniel muttered, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He knew her. A year ago, in the thaw of spring, he had pried open a steel trap with his bare hands to free this very dog. He had walked away then, bloody palmed, never expecting to see her again. But here she was, back in the storm, and her eyes burned with the unmistakable demand. Follow me. Daniel's instincts warred inside him. This could be a trick of the storm, his mind layering old ghosts onto a desperate stray. But then the shepherd barked once more, sharp and clipped, and spun toward the tree line. She staggered on a back leg, scarred pale against her dark coat, then looked over her shoulder as if to say, "Hurry." Every fiber of Marine training told him to hold position, assess. Yet another, older voice, one forged not by combat but by compassion, pressed harder. He had heard that tone before, on battlefields, when brothers cried for help. Daniel tightened the strap of his rifle and stepped forward. The shepherd bolted into the storm, not with the panic of a feral creature, but with the precision of a guide. She moved a dozen yards ahead, then stopped, rising once more on her hind legs. The gesture was unmistakable, not instinct, intent. Daniel's breath caught. "What the hell happened to you?" Snow clawed at his face as he followed her into the timber. The trail narrowed, the drifts deeper. He slipped once, catching himself against a pine trunk, and when he looked up, the shepherd was waiting, ears flattened, eyes fixed on him, not leaving him behind, not letting him turn back. Then came the twist that made his blood run colder than the wind. In the snow between them lay a line of boot prints, heavy, deliberate, crossing the dog's trail. Daniel crouched, brushing away the top layer. The edges were sharp, recent. Someone else had been here, maybe within the last 24 hours. Not a hiker. The tread was wrong too wide, too heavy. He knew it from whispers in town. Poachers. The shepherd whined low, urgent. Not fear, not warning, something worse. She needed him to see. Daniel straightened, scanning the timber. Nothing but white and shadow. Still, the old heat climbed his spine, the one he thought he'd buried with the core. He was not just walking into a rescue. He was walking into a fight, though he didn't yet know with whom. The shepherd barked again, sharp, commanding. She pivoted and limped forward, deeper into the storm. Daniel hesitated only a second, then muttered into the wind, "All right, girl." Show Me the Storm swallowed his words, but she heard. She barked once, then vanished into the trees. For the first time in years, Daniel's pulse raced, not from memory, not from ghosts, but from something alive and urgent, pulling him back into service. Not of country, not of war, but of a promise he had never spoken aloud, that no one man or beast would be left behind. And so, with the blizzard clawing at his back and the unknown ahead, Daniel Cross followed the German shepherd into the white silence. The snow thickened as Daniel pushed deeper into the pines, each step muffled by the storm's relentless cover. His breath burned in his chest, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dog ahead. She moved in bursts 20 feet forward, then pausing, turning back toward him with that same piercing gaze. It was not the look of a stray leading a man at random. It was deliberate, focused. She wanted him with her. At the crest of a narrow rise, she stopped again and lifted onto her hind legs. The sight struck Daniel like a round to the chest. He knew this dog. The scar on her hind leg caught the glow of pale light filtering through the storm. A crooked line of hairless skin running from the joint down toward her paw. Daniel's throat tightened. That scar had his blood on it. Last spring, he had stumbled across a shepherd caught in a steel trap along the river flats. He had nearly lost his fingers prying the rusted jaws apart, his palms shredded and bleeding by the time the dog broke free. She had limped away then, terrified, eyes wide and mistrustful. He had figured she would vanish into the wilderness forever. Yet here she was, standing before him in the storm, not with fear, but with recognition. "You remember me," Daniel whispered, his voice ragged against the wind. The shepherd whined low, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She barked once, short and clipped, then pivoted towards the ravine. Her message was as clear as any marine hand signal. "Follow." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct from his training screamed caution. Unknown terrain, unknown threat, visible signs of poachers nearby. He was walking into someone else's territory blind. But then she looked back at him, eyes burning amber against the storm, and he saw more than desperation. He saw trust. The last time someone had looked at him like that was on a battlefield, a young corporal bleeding out under rubble, trusting Daniel to drag him out alive. That boy hadn't made it. The memory never left him. And now here was a shepherd, asking again, demanding again, with eyes that gave him no room for retreat. Daniel clenched his jaw. "All right," he muttered. "I'm coming." He adjusted the rifle across his shoulder and pressed forward. The shepherd moved quickly, despite the limp. Her body cut through drifts with practiced strength, but every so often she glanced back, measuring the distance between them. The storm seemed to bend around her urgency. Halfway down the slope, Daniel stopped cold. The snow ahead bore more than paw prints. A second trail heavier, deeper, unmistakable cut across hers. Boot prints, large and deliberate. He crouched, brushing away the powder with a gloved hand. The edges were crisp, too sharp to be more than a day old. And they weren't alone. Smaller prints paralleled them. At least 2 men, maybe more, hauling something heavy. The shepherd growled, low and guttural, her hackles rising. She didn't break eye contact with Daniel. It wasn't a warning. It was confirmation. She knew what he was seeing, and she wanted him to understand. There was danger ahead. A flicker of movement made his stomach tighten. Far down the ridge, a shadow shifted between the trees, too tall and steady to be mistaken for wildlife. Daniel dropped to one knee, his rifle angled but not raised. He had no clean shot and no desire to start a fight in a blizzard. But his heart hammered in the old rhythm, the one he thought he'd left in Fallujah. Watch the shadows. Read the ground. Every step could kill you. The shepherd barked once, sharp and defiant. dragging his attention back to her. Then she bolted forward again, vanishing into a curtain of falling snow. Daniel cursed under his breath. He wanted to back out, return to the safety of his cabin, file a report in town. But that was the old habit turning away, hiding from ghosts. He had done enough of that. And the shepherd had not come to him by chance. She had chosen him, found him, remembered him. He stood and pressed on. The storm thickened, flakes blinding, drifts swallowing his boots to the knee. His lungs burned with the cold, and the rifle dug into his shoulder with each jarring step. Still he moved, following the dark silhouette ahead. She never slowed, even when she stumbled. Then suddenly she stopped. At the edge of a clearing, she turned and locked eyes with him once more. Rising again onto her hind legs, her paws lifted as if pleading, as if commanding. Daniel's chest clenched. The last time she had done this, it had been to beg for freedom from steel jaws. Now it was for something else, something unseen but urgent. The wind howled, carrying with it a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. A whimper, high-pitched, trembling, and alive. Daniel froze. The shepherd barked once, spun, and bounded down the slope into the clearing. Her body vanished into the white. He followed, sliding, stumbling, his heart hammering faster with each step. Whatever waited ahead was not just about poachers, not just about survival. He could feel it now, an invisible tether pulling him into the heart of the storm. And though the blizzard roared around him, Daniel Cross knew with sudden clarity he was no longer walking alone. The shepherd had come back for him, not as a stranger, not as a stray, but as a comrade calling him into service once again. The storm seemed to close in tighter as Daniel followed the shepherd down into the gulch. Snow stung his eyes, clung to his beard, filled his boots. Still he pressed forward, guided by the dog's determined stride. She limped, but her pace never faltered, her body weaving through the drifts with a will stronger than the storm itself. The ground dipped sharply. Daniel slid the last few yards, boots skidding across ice, until he landed hard on one knee. The world down here was muffled, the wind a distant roar above the ravine walls. And then he heard it faint, broken, a sound that pierced deeper than the cold. A whimper. The shepherd lunged toward a shattered spruce lying across the ravine floor. Snow had buried most of the trunk, but at its base, pressed beneath splintered branches, something struggled. Daniel's gut clenched as he saw the small body another shepherd, no more than a pup, its fur lighter but already marked with black along the back. One hind leg was twisted under the weight of the tree, blood spreading in sharp red against the snow. The mother barked sharply, circling, digging frantically at the snow, but careful not to crush the pup further. Then she turned to Daniel, her eyes blazing, not pleading anymore, commanding. Daniel's chest seized. For a heartbeat he was back in Iraq. Dust and smoke choking the air, a collapsed wall pinning a young private, the weight too much for bare hands. He remembered the frantic digging, the desperate cries, the blood pooling in the sand. He had saved some. He had lost others. The memories slammed into him now, raw and uninvited. The pup whimpered again, weaker this time. Daniel snapped back to the present. He dropped his rifle into the snow and lunged to the trunk. His gloved hands clawed at the branches, trying to free the pup, but the weight was crushing. He braced his boots, shoved hard, muscles burning. The tree shifted an inch, no more. "Hang on, little one," he muttered through gritted teeth. He scanned the ravine, desperate for leverage. A broken limb jutted nearby, thick and sturdy enough. He seized it, jammed it beneath the trunk, and threw his weight onto it. His boots slipped, his shoulders screamed, but slowly, agonizingly, the spruce lifted just enough. The mother barked sharply, her voice raw with urgency. Daniel thrust an arm under the trunk, grabbed the pup by the scruff and yanked it free. He collapsed back into the snow with the small body in his arms. The pup whimpered once, then went still, its chest fluttering with shallow breaths. The shepherd rushed forward, pressing her muzzle against her pup, licking frantically at the blood. But her gaze never left Daniel, eyes locked, fierce and unwavering. She knew who had made the difference. Daniel tore open the field kit strapped to his pack. The canvas was worn, the edges frayed from years of use, but it still carried everything he needed. Gauze, cloth strips, antiseptic. He pressed gauze against the wound, his fingers already slick with the pup's blood. "Easy," he whispered, voice low, steady, the same tone he had once used for wounded Marines. "You're tougher than you look." The pup twitched, whimpered, then pressed its head weakly against his hand. The mother let out a low whine, her body quivering with equal parts fear and trust. She hovered close, almost touching, but gave him space to work. She was no longer a wild dog. She was a comrade, watching over her child, placing that fragile life in his hands. Then the plot twisted again. Above them, faint but unmistakable, came the crunch of boots on snow. Daniel's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. Through the veil of flakes, a shadow moved along the rim of the ravine. Too tall, too steady to be an animal. The shepherd growled, a low rumble that vibrated through the frozen air. Her ears pricked, her body tensed to spring. Daniel pressed the bandage tighter against the pup's leg, his mind racing. He had thought the danger lay only in the storm and the fallen tree. But now he understood. They weren't alone out here. The shadow lingered a moment, then slipped back into the trees, leaving only silence. Daniel's pulse hammered. He bound the pup's leg quickly, knotting the cloth with practiced precision. The bleeding slowed, though the pup still trembled in his hands. He cradled it close to his chest, shielding it from the wind. The mother pressed against his side, her warmth bleeding through his frozen coat. Her amber eyes met his, fierce and unyielding. Together they both knew this was only the beginning. Daniel rose slowly, the pup bundled against him, the mother flanking close. Above them, hidden in the storm, someone was watching. And as he started the climb out of the ravine, Daniel Cross felt the weight of war settle back onto his shoulders, not in the desert sands of Iraq, but here, in the frozen silence of Wyoming. The battlefield had found him again. Daniel knelt in the snow, his breath ragged, his gloves soaked crimson as he kept pressure on the pup's wound. The storm pressed down on the ravine like a living thing, sealing them in silence, broken only by the pup's faint cries and the mother's low whine. Then a voice cut through the wind. "Daniel Cross." He stiffened, head snapping up, instinct dragging his hand to the rifle buried in the snow beside him. A figure moved carefully down the slope, green parka hood pulled low, a walking staff in one hand. The woman's face emerged from the blur of snow-sharp, weather-worn, her brown hair braided tight beneath the fur lining. "Easy," she said, lifting one hand. "It's Claire Donovan." Forest Service Daniel's breath eased, but his posture stayed rigid. He knew the name. Claire was a ranger assigned to this stretch of the Wind River backcountry. Locals said she was tireless, sharp-eyed, and never turned a blind eye to trouble. He hadn't expected to see her this far into the storm. She reached the base of the ravine, eyes sweeping the scene. Daniel crouched with the bleeding pup, the shepherd standing guard, her hackles raised but not attacking. Claire dropped to one knee beside him without hesitation. "Let me see," she said, pulling off her gloves. Daniel shifted slightly, allowing her to inspect the bandage he'd tied. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, checking the pup's pulse, adjusting the gauze. She glanced at him once, her expression unreadable. "You kept him alive," she said simply. Most people wouldn't have had the hand steady enough for that. Daniel swallowed. didn't have a choice. The mother growled low, leaning close to her pup. Claire froze for a heartbeat, then extended her hand slowly, palm open. The shepherd's amber eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to Claire. After a tense second, she lowered her head, allowing Claire to touch the pup's flank. "That's trust," Claire murmured. "Doesn't happen often out here." Daniel looked away, focusing on the tree line above. "She remembers me. I freed her from a trap last spring." Claire's brow tightened. "Then she knows you're the only one who can help her now." The pup whimpered, and Claire worked quickly, replacing Daniel's makeshift wrap with cleaner bandaging from her satchel. Her movements were efficient, precise, the kind of care born from years of tending both wild and domestic creatures. Daniel held the pup steady, his jaw clenched against the tremor in his hands. When they finished, the pup settled against the blanket Claire pulled from her pack. The mother immediately curled protectively around her, but her eyes never left Daniel, watching every breath he took. Claire's gaze swept the ground around them. Her staff nudged aside a mound of snow, revealing a loop of wire glinting faintly in the pale light. She pulled it free, a snare, cruelly tightened, its steel edges stiff with frost. "Damn it," she muttered. Poachers. Bold enough to work this close to the ridge, Daniel's gut tightened. "I saw boot prints on the way down." Heavy ones. 2 sets at least. Claire scanned the slope above, her expression hardening. "I've been pulling traps all winter, but this is a full operation. They'll kill anything that wanders too close." She dropped the snare into the snow with disgust. "Elk, deer, dogs." The mother let out a low, guttural growl, as if she understood. She pawed the snow near the snare, then looked back at Daniel, her gaze fierce and deliberate. Claire's eyes flicked between them. "She's showing you. This isn't random. She brought you here for a reason." Daniel met the shepherd's stare, something unspoken passing between them. He felt the same pull he had felt when she first appeared in the storm, that raw, desperate insistence that went beyond instinct. Then came the sound that stiffened them both, a sharp metallic snap from deeper in the trees, followed by the faint cry of another animal. Claire's head jerked up. Daniel's pulse surged. "They're still out here," she whispered. The shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding, then bolted a few steps towards the sound before stopping, glancing back at Daniel as if daring him to refuse. Claire gripped her staff, her jaw set. "We can't chase them in this storm. But we need to get this pup out, now. If the poachers are moving, they'll come back for their traps. And if they find us here..." Daniel adjusted the rifle on his shoulder, the decision already made. "Then we make sure they don't." Claire met his eyes, searching, then gave a single nod. "Cabin's closer than the ranger station. Yours will have to do." Daniel cradled the pup carefully, rising to his feet. The mother pressed close, her flank brushing his leg, her presence both a guard and a vow. He looked down at her once, a grim smile tugging at his mouth. "You chose me again," he murmured. The shepherd barked softly, almost an answer, and together they began the climb out of the ravine. 3 humans and 1 determined dog, the storm and the snares closing in around them. And in Daniel's chest, beneath the weight of the rifle and the pup, something old stirred an awareness he hadn't wanted to admit. He wasn't just following the shepherd anymore, he was letting her lead him back into the fight. The cabin walls groaned as the storm clawed at them, but inside the air was still, the fire crackling in the stove throwing shadows across the log walls. Daniel knelt on the wooden floor, the pup laid out before him on a folded blanket. His gloves lay discarded on the hearth. His bare hands trembled, not from cold, but from memory. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound was angry and raw, the pup's shallow breaths quick and uncertain. Daniel's field kit was spread open across the floor, canvas pouch spilling its contents like a surgeon's table. He pressed fresh gauze against the leg, his jaw set, every movement deliberate. The mother shepherd hovered inches away, her body quivering with tension, her amber eyes locked on his hands. Daniel didn't flinch under her stare. He'd seen those eyes before, not hers, but the same look. A brother in arms, pinned under rubble in Fallujah, eyes blazing with trust and desperation. His chest tightened. The memory hit fast, sharper than the sting of blood on his skin. Dust, smoke, the cries of men buried alive. He had clawed through stone and steel with his bare hands, pulled a corporal out by the straps of his vest while mortars fell around them. He had felt the man's weight in his arms, alive one moment, gone the next. Now he looked down at the pup, ribs fluttering with each breath, and the battlefield folded over the cabin floor. His hands shook. Claire crouched across from him, steady and calm. She said nothing, but her presence anchored him. Her ranger's hands moved with quiet precision, handing him strips of cloth, a vial of antiseptic, a needle already threaded. Her voice was low, matter of fact. "Stitching will hold better if you keep the pressure even." "I'll keep the leg steady." Daniel drew a breath, the old marine rhythm kicking back into place. He leaned over the pup, his fingers steadying as muscle memory took over. The needle pierced skin, blood welling dark against fur. The pup whimpered, but the mother leaned closer, pressing her muzzle against its flank, a soft rumble vibrating in her chest. Not panic. Encouragement. "You're not alone," Daniel murmured, unsure if he was speaking to the pup or himself. The mother raised her head, eyes catching the firelight. She stood tall over her pup, her stance protective yet still, her gaze fixed on Daniel, unwavering. Trust, total and absolute. Daniel's throat burned. He bent closer, working stitch after stitch, the rhythm like breathing, like the drills in the course. The old ghosts pressed in, memories of blooded uniforms, bandages tied too late. But every time his focus wavered, the shepherd's gaze pulled him back. Halfway through, the pup jerked, a sharp cry escaping its throat. Daniel froze, fear spiking through him. His vision tunneled, just for an instant, back to a desert alley where a young Marine convulsed under his hands. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memory down. Claire's voice broke through. "Stay with me, Cross." "He's still here. You've got this." Daniel blinked hard, breath ragged, then drove the needle through again. Steady, sure. The pup quieted, its head falling against the blanket. Its chest still rose and fell, faint but steady. Daniel tied the final knot with trembling fingers, then sat back, his hands slick with blood, his heart thundering. The shepherd moved immediately, nosing her pup, licking gently at its face, then turning to Daniel. Her muzzle hovered near his hand, her breath warm against his torn skin. He expected suspicion, even hostility. Instead, she pressed her nose firmly against his wrist, as if sealing a pact. Daniel swallowed hard, heat rising behind his eyes. "You trust me more than I trust myself." For a long moment, the cabin held its breath. The storm outside raged, but inside the fire's glow wrapped them in fragile peace. Then Claire shifted, drawing Daniel's attention to the window. Her expression sharpened. "Look." Daniel followed her gaze. In the distance, faint against the swirling white, a flicker of movement. Shadows sliding between trees, too purposeful to be deer. Poachers. His stomach dropped. The fight wasn't finished. The stitches held for now, but the storm had only given them cover. Out there, in the dark, men moved with wire and steel, the same cruelty that had scarred Sable's leg and nearly killed her pup. Daniel reached for his rifle, his hand steady now, not because the ghosts had vanished, but because he was no longer carrying them alone. The shepherd stood tall at his side, her eyes fixed on the dark beyond the cabin walls. Old scars throbbed, new wounds bled, but in that fragile space between firelight and storm, Daniel Cross knew one thing with clarity. The war wasn't behind him. It was here, and he would not walk away this time. Morning broke hard and cold, a pale light sliding through the cabin's frosted window. The fire in the stove had burned low, but the small room still carried its warmth. The pup slept bundled against the blanket, its breaths shallow but steady. The mother shepherd stood at the door, ears pricked, muscles taut as if the night had taught her vigilance no storm could erase. Daniel strapped on his boots with slow, deliberate motions. He hadn't slept much. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of shadow on the ridge, heard the crunch of boots that didn't belong. Old instincts wouldn't let him rest. Claire stirred from her place by the hearth, her ranger's coat draped over her shoulders. She rose stiffly, rubbing at her knee, then moved to the window. Her gaze swept the snow outside. Tracks held through the night. She murmured. They didn't just set traps. Their dragging carcasses. Daniel joined her, his jaw tightening. The snow beyond the cabin showed faint lines, grooves where something heavy had been pulled, covered but not erased by the storm. He pushed the door open, the shepherd slipping out first, her paws silent against the crust of ice. She sniffed once, then gave a low growl, her eyes narrowing towards the tree line. They followed. The air was knife-sharp, every breath burning as it entered the lungs. Daniel's boots crunched into a set of prints deep and wide. He crouched, brushing snow away with a gloved hand. The tread was fresh, sharper than what he'd seen yesterday. The poachers had moved closer. Claire crouched beside him, her fingers tracing the frozen edge. Size 12, maybe 13. Heavy step. That's a man carrying weight or hauling game. She shifted, pointing to a second line of prints just yards away. Another one. Smaller. 2 of them, at least. The shepherd barked once, sharp and clipped, before darting ahead. She stopped near a cluster of pines and pawed furiously at the snow. Daniel jogged to her, the cold biting harder as he approached. His gut knotted when he saw what she uncovered. A loop of cable wire, stiff with frost, anchored between 2 saplings. Blood stained the snow beneath it, dark against white. "Dear," Claire said, her voice flat. She used her staff to prod the wire, dislodging a tuft of fur still caught in the steel. Maybe elk. Either way, they didn't just set these traps. They've been harvesting. Daniel straightened, scanning the trees. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the whisper of the wind. His pulse quickened. He could feel it, the sense of eyes on his back, the same crawl under the skin he'd known in alleyways overseas when an ambush lay waiting. The shepherd stiffened suddenly, head snapping toward the ridge. Her ears pricked, tail rigid, every muscle coiled. She didn't bark this time. She held still, her body angled towards the shadows as if she saw what Daniel could not. He raised his rifle, eyes narrowing. Snow shifted far off among the trees. A flicker, gone in a breath. Claire whispered, "They're watching us." Daniel didn't move. His finger rested along the trigger guard, steady but ready. The shepherd let out a low rumble, not loud, but steady, vibrating through the cold air. She held her ground beside him, gaze locked on the unseen presence. Then, as quickly as it had come, the sense lifted. The forest stilled again, blank and indifferent. But the damage was done. They weren't chasing shadows anymore. The poachers were close enough to study them, close enough to know they'd interfered. Claire drew in a slow breath. They won't like us pulling their traps. Daniel's eyes stayed on the tree line. Good. Let them know we're here. The shepherd barked once, sharp as a command, before turning her head toward the pup back at the cabin. She lingered, as if torn between guarding her wounded young and facing the threat in the trees. Finally, she pressed against Daniel's leg, a fleeting touch that felt like a vow. Daniel lowered the rifle, though his shoulders stayed taut. He knew what she was telling him. The fight wasn't over. The real danger hadn't shown itself yet. They turned back toward the cabin, but Daniel's mind stayed locked on the prints in the snow, the grooves of dragged bodies, the flicker of shadow on the ridge. The poachers weren't ghosts. They were real, armed and near. And from the way the shepherd bristled, Daniel understood something chilling. The men in the woods hadn't come for deer alone. They were hunting anything that trusted too much, anything that lingered where it shouldn't. And now, that included him. The storm had eased by the time they reached the cabin, though the wind still pushed hard against the timber walls as Daniel shouldered the door open. Warmth didn't greet them, only the dry chill of a space gone cold overnight. He crossed to the stove without pause, laying the pup carefully on a folded quilt near the hearth before striking a match to the wood stacked inside. Flame caught, hissed, then rose. Orange light spread across the room, painting the logs in shifting shadows. The shepherd paced once around her pup, nose pressed close to its tiny body, then sat at the door, ears pricked, as though she had claimed the threshold as her post. Claire shed her coat, steam lifting from its shoulders, and crouched beside Daniel. He was already unrolling bandages, his movements clipped, precise. He didn't look at her, eyes fixed on the wound he had stitched earlier. Bleeding slowed. Claire said softly. Daniel gave a curt nod, pressing his palm against the pup's ribcage, counting. Still shallow. Needs heat, needs quiet. The pup stirred faintly, a thin cry escaping its throat. The mother whined, low and steady, but didn't break from her post. Her eyes never left Daniel's hands, watching every movement with the same fierce scrutiny as a commander ensuring no mistake would cost a soldier's life. Claire pulled a tin mug from her pack, filling it with snow she set near the stove. I'll get water. Broth, if we're lucky. Daniel stayed silent. His hands worked as if on autopilot, steady, sure, even as a faint tremor threaded his shoulders. Claire noticed but didn't comment. Instead, she studied his face in the flickering firelight. The lines etched deep around his eyes weren't just from age. They were carved by years of carrying weight no man should have to bear alone. You've done this before, she said quietly, his jaw tightened. Too many times. The fire popped, casting sparks against the stove door. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of flame, the pup's faint breathing, and the low hum of wind outside. Claire shifted closer, her voice lower still. You're not just a man living in the woods, are you? Daniel finally looked up. His grey-blue eyes were tired but steady. I'm exactly that. But Claire shook her head. She saw more in him now. Not just the hardness, not just the discipline. She saw the way he spoke to the pup in whispers he might once have used for wounded brothers, the way the shepherd trusted him with absolute certainty. This wasn't the detachment of a hermit. This was a man still fighting battles no one else could see. The pup whimpered again. Daniel's gaze snapped back down, his hand smoothing gently along its side. Easy, he murmured. You're safe now. The shepherd at the door whined softly in response, her amber eyes glinting in the firelight. For the first time since the storm, she lowered herself to the floor, head resting on her paws, her body angled protectively toward both pup and man. Claire watched the exchange, something tugging at her chest. She knows, she whispered. Daniel glanced up. Knows what? That you're carrying more than just her pup. She trusts you because you're one of her own. A fighter who's still standing, Daniel didn't answer. He pressed a fresh cloth gently against the stitched leg, his hands steady even as his throat burned with unspoken memory. He thought of the men he had carried, the ones who hadn't made it, of blood-soaking sand, of voices cut short. And now, in the flicker of firelight, he realized he was fighting just as hard for a pup who had never seen war but bore its cruelty all the same. The cabin filled with heat at last. The pup shifted closer to the warmth, curling faintly into the blanket. Its breathing deepened, fragile but stronger. Daniel sat back, his shoulders slumping against the wall. The shepherd lifted her head, eyes on him. She rose, stepped forward, and pressed her muzzle against his arm. Daniel froze, startled by the gesture. Then slowly, he let his hand rest on her head. Her fur was coarse, still damp from the storm, but warm. The contact was brief, but it was enough. A bridge between them, built on scars, old and new. Claire broke the silence. They'll be back, you know. Whoever set those traps. The carcass drags we saw weren't just for food. They're making money off this. Big money. Daniel's hand tightened on the shepherd's fur. Let them come. Claire studied him, hearing not just anger but something deeper. Resolve. She had seen men like him before. Men who had returned from war with eyes still locked on battlefields long gone. But unlike some, Daniel hadn't surrendered to the darkness. He was still answering calls for help, even when he hadn't realized it. The shepherd stepped back to her post at the door, ears sharp, body alert once more. The pup slept in fragile peace, firelight soft against its face. And in that small cabin carved into the wilderness, something unspoken passed between them all. Trust, hard-won and fragile, but strong enough to hold against the storm. Claire looked at Daniel, her voice steady but gentle. You're not alone out here. Not anymore. He didn't answer, but when he looked back at her, the fire caught in his eyes, and for the first time she saw something beyond the marine steel. She saw the man underneath, fighting not just for survival, but for a reason to keep going. The shepherd's ears flicked once towards the window. She gave a low growl, faint but certain, before settling again. Claire and Daniel exchanged a glance. The poachers were still out there. But inside the cabin, by the fire, trust had found its first spark. Night settled heavy on the mountains, the kind of darkness that pressed against windows and swallowed sound. The fire in the stove burned low, throwing faint orange light across the cabin. The pup slept near the hearth, its tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. Daniel sat at the table, rifle leaning against the wall beside him, his posture rigid even in the quiet. Then Sable lifted her head. Her ears pricked, her body tense. A low growl rumbled in her chest, so deep it vibrated through the wooden floor. Daniel froze. He had heard that sound before, from canines alerting to an enemy in the shadows. Claire rose quickly from her chair, her hand already on the staff propped against the wall. "What is it?" she whispered. Sable answered for him. She barked once, sharp and cutting, then lunged to the door, claws scraping against the planks. Her body stiffened like a drawn bow, amber eyes blazing into the dark beyond the window. Daniel grabbed his rifle and eased to the door. Through the frosted glass he caught the faintest flicker movement among the pines, shadows sliding where no deer would tread. "They're here," he muttered. Claire's jaw set. She moved to the window on the far side, peering into the trees. 2 of them, maybe 3. The shepherd barked again, tail rigid, body trembling with tension. The sound was not panicked. It was a warning, precise and sharp, like a signal on a battlefield. Daniel's pulse quickened, the old rhythm of combat surging in his veins. But this wasn't Fallujah. This wasn't Kandahar. The enemy wasn't insurgents in an alley. It was men with wire and steel, trespassing on land that wasn't theirs, threatening lives that had chosen to trust him. He set his jaw. Not tonight. The door rattled suddenly, hard enough to shake snow loose from the roof. A voice came from the dark, muffled but clear. "Cross. We know you're in there. Hand over the mutt. That pup's worth more than you'll ever see in your life." Claire stiffened. "They're after the dogs." Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened. "Over my dead body." Sable pressed against his leg, her body solid, unflinching. She growled low, never taking her eyes off the door. Another voice called out, harsher, closer. "Step aside, Marine. This isn't your fight. You want to keep living quiet in that shack. Let us take what's ours." Daniel felt something inside him ignite. He opened the door just enough to step onto the porch, rifle angled but not raised. The cold slammed into him, sharp and biting, but his focus narrowed on the figures standing at the tree line. 3 men, heavy coats, rifles slung, eyes gleaming in the firelight, spilling from the cabin. "This is my fight," Daniel said, his voice steady. "And you're trespassing on my land." One of the men laughed. "Your land? The game here belongs to no one. The strong take what they want." Sable lunged forward, barking in a rapid rhythm, her body bristling with fury. The sound echoed through the woods, sharp as gunfire. The men flinched. Daniel didn't lower his rifle. "You set another trap on this mountain, and I'll tear it out with my own hands." "You cross this porch, and you'll wish you hadn't." For a heartbeat, silence held. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavier than any blizzard. Then the smallest twist hit. The third man stepped closer, his face visible in the moonlight. He was younger, early 20s, his jaw tight, but his eyes uneasy. His gaze darted to the pup's faint cries inside the cabin. For a flicker of a second, guilt crossed his face. Sable's barking cut through the moment, her body angled protectively between Daniel and the men. She didn't lunge, she didn't retreat. She simply stood her ground, her growls carrying the same message Daniel's voice had. Not one step closer. The leader spat into the snow. "This isn't over, Cross." He jerked his head, and the group melted back into the trees, boots crunching, shadows swallowed by the forest. Daniel held still, rifle at the ready, until the night quieted. Only then did he lower it, his chest heaving with controlled breath. Claire stepped beside him, her voice low. "They'll come back." Daniel nodded, eyes still locked on the tree line. "Then we'll be ready." Sable pressed against his leg once more, her breath steaming in the cold, her eyes never leaving the darkness. Daniel reached down, his hand brushing her head, rough and deliberate. "Not Iraq," he murmured, "but it's my war now." Inside, the pup whimpered softly, then settled again by the fire. And for the first time in years, Daniel Cross felt the weight of battle, not as a curse, but as a calling. He wasn't fighting for orders or flags. He was fighting for trust, for life, for the promise that nothing left in his care would be abandoned again. And Sable, steadfast at his side, made it clear. He wasn't fighting alone. The night bled into morning without rest. The fire in the cabin had burned down to glowing embers, and Daniel hadn't closed his eyes once. Sable hadn't either. She stayed at the door, nose lifted toward the cracks in the wood, ears twitching at the slightest sound outside. The pup slept, oblivious, its breathing steadier now beneath the blanket. Claire had slipped out at first light, moving quiet and purposeful into the trees with her radio clipped to her shoulder. Daniel knew she was calling in help. Rangers, deputies, maybe even state police. Poachers didn't stop after being warned. They came back meaner, hungrier. When the knock came at the cabin door, it wasn't gentle. Sable erupted, her bark blasting like a gunshot. She lunged, teeth bared, body tense as a coiled spring. Daniel snapped up his rifle, adrenaline flooding his chest. He swung open the door to find Claire, breath steaming, face set in grim determination. Behind her, 2 uniformed deputies trudged through the snow, rifles slung. "They're close," Claire said, voice clipped. "We tracked fresh prints past the ridge. They've got a camp a quarter-mile east." It's time Daniel tightened the strap on his coat, jaw hard. "Let's end it." The small group moved into the forest, boots crunching over crusted snow. Sable trotted ahead, her movements sharp, precise, like she was reading the woods. Each time she paused, the deputies glanced at Daniel as if waiting for her signal. He only nodded. She was leading them straight into the truth. They found the camp in a clearing scarred by smoke and blood. Carcasses hung half-buried in snow, wire snares coiled on stumps. Tents sagged beneath frost. And 3 men stood at the center, rifles leaning against a log, eyes wide when the rangers stepped into view. "Hands where we can see them," Claire ordered. 2 of the men obeyed quickly, curses spilling from their mouths. The 3rd froze, the young one from the night before. His rifle still rested against the log, but his eyes darted from Claire to Daniel, panic flashing like a storm. Then recognition hit Daniel like a hammer. The man's face scar running from temple to jaw, eyes hollowed by things seen too early, wasn't a stranger's. He was military. Daniel had seen that posture, that weight in the shoulders, in men who came back broken. "Marine Corps?" Daniel asked quietly, rifle steady but voice cracking with something that wasn't anger. The man blinked hard. His lips trembled before words broke free. "2nd Battalion, Fallujah. I didn't make it out the way you did." The deputies stiffened, fingers twitching on their triggers. But Daniel felt something else rising, recognition, dread, the gut-deep fear of what he might have become if he had let his own ghosts drag him too far. "You're better than this," Daniel said, his voice low but cutting through the wind. "Better than wire snares and bleeding pups in the snow." The man's jaw worked. For a second his eyes flicked toward Sable, who stood between them, barking sharp, as if she could pierce whatever fog hung over him. Her tail stiff, her gaze unyielding. She didn't see a poacher. She saw a threat to her pup, to the trust she had placed in Daniel. The deputies moved in, shackles ready. The other 2 men cursed and fought, but Sable lunged forward with a bark so fierce it split the clearing. One man stumbled back into the snow, dropping his weapon. The other froze, staring wide-eyed at the shepherd who had no fear. The younger veteran didn't fight. His shoulders sagged. He dropped to his knees, hands spread in the snow. I didn't know where else to go," he whispered, voice breaking. Daniel's chest tightened. He could see the wreckage behind the man's eyes, the same wreckage he had battled in the silence of his cabin. A version of himself that could have walked the same path if not for discipline, for a thin thread of purpose, for the dogs that had trusted him when men couldn't. As the deputies cuffed the poachers, Claire's radio crackled with confirmation. Backup was en route. The forest felt lighter, as though the trees themselves exhaled relief. But Daniel stood frozen, watching the veteran's bowed head. The snow swirled between them, erasing footprints even as they were made. Sable pressed against his leg, her warmth steady, her eyes still locked on the captured men. She had known, before any of them, that something dangerous lived in these woods, and Daniel, staring at the broken Marine in chains, understood the twist of fate. He wasn't just fighting poachers, he was staring into the mirror of what he might have become, what he still feared he could become, if he ever surrendered his humanity. He dropped a hand to Sable's head, grounding himself in her strength. "Not today," he whispered. The deputies hauled the men away, their curses fading into the distance. Snow fell heavier, covering the cruel scars of the camp. But Daniel knew some scars never vanished. Still, as Sable nudged his hand and the pup's faint yip echoed from the cabin in the distance, he also knew this. Redemption was possible. Not for everyone, not always. But sometimes, in the hush of falling snow, truth could be seen clearly enough to change the course of a man's life. And Daniel Cross, with a shepherd at his side, wasn't about to let that truth slip away. Snow fell softer that night, as if the storm itself had finally run out of anger. The cabin glowed faintly against the darkness, a beacon in the endless white. Inside, warmth radiated from the stove, the fire crackling steady, its light catching on rough-hewn timbers and the worn lines of Daniel's face. The pup stirred near the hearth, shifting beneath the blanket. Its breaths were slower now, deeper, the fever of pain beginning to break. Each small twitch of its paws, each faint sigh, carried the rhythm of survival. Sable was never far. She paced the cabin in slow arcs, circling back again and again to her pup before returning to her post by the door. Her amber eyes never dulled. They burned steady, like lanterns cutting through the night. Claire finished writing in her small notebook, snapping it shut with a soft click. She rose, pulling on her coat. "The deputies have the poachers in custody," she said, her voice carrying both relief and fatigue. "The forest is safer tonight because of you." Daniel looked up from where he sat on the floor, one hand resting on the pup's small body. He didn't answer right away. Words had always been harder than action for him. His eyes moved to Sable, then back to the fire. "I just did what had to be done." Claire studied him, the lines etched deep into his face, the shadows of 1,000 untold battles. Then her voice softened. "Daniel, you saved more than them tonight. You saved yourself." For a moment the room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the pup's even breathing. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because in her words he heard a truth he had spent years running from. He rose, walked her to the door. She opened it, and the cold spilled in, sharp but clean. The night sky was clear now, stars scattered like shards of glass over the Wind River peaks. Claire paused at the threshold, looking back one last time. "Take care of them. They trust you more than anyone." Daniel nodded. "I will." She gave a brief smile, then stepped into the snow, her figure fading into the dark, the crunch of her boots disappearing into silence. Inside, Sable moved to the door, watching until Claire was gone. Then she lay across the threshold, her body stretched long, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. Her presence filled the cabin with a sense of unshakable safety, a silent vow carved into the night. Daniel returned to the pup, kneeling beside it, its tiny head nudged against his palm, a weak but deliberate gesture. He let out a slow breath, one that carried months of isolation, years of war, and the weight of everything he had nearly lost. "You're home now," he whispered. The fire popped, casting sparks into the chimney. Shadows danced along the walls, soft and fleeting. For the first time in a long time, Daniel Cross felt his cabin was no longer just a place to hide. It was a place where trust could grow again. Hours later, when the night was at its deepest, the scene held steady. The pup slept curled tight by the stove, chest rising with each breath. Sable lay at the door, eyes open, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside, as if daring it to try again. Daniel watched them both, his heart steadying in a way it hadn't in years. He thought of the broken Marine who had walked the wrong road, of the snares that scarred more than flesh, of the choices that carved men into who they became. And he realized that, here in the quiet of his cabin, with a shepherd standing guard and a pup healed by firelight, he had been given something rare, a second chance. He leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire on his face, the sound of life steady around him. And as sleep finally crept into his bones, he thought of the countless stories like his, untold, waiting in the hearts of those who had known loyalty, in its purest form. What's your story with a loyal pet? If this touched you, share it with someone who needs hope tonight. And if you believe German Shepherds carry a piece of the warrior spirit within them, join us here on the German Shepherd channel. Subscribe and walk with us through more stories of courage, trust, and second chances. Because every life saved, every bond formed, reminds us of one thing: loyalty never leaves us behind.